Thank you so much, Bob. It is a great pleasure and honor to receive this medal for the Rumelhart Prize, which I'm going to wear during the talk. I wish we could all be together to celebrate this amazing award for which I'm truly honored. This is not going to happen this year, I hope next year. And meanwhile, from my office here in Saclay near Paris, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about my research on the origins of mathematical thinking and of the human singularity. What I mean by that is that, as you can see on this fresco, which adorns the walls of Neurospin, the center that I direct south of Paris, the human brain is special. The human brain has this unique ability to create science, to create mathematics, to create language. And this is my object of study. What's special about it that's different from the monkey brain? I'd like to propose a few hypotheses about that. Before I get too much into that, I'd like to acknowledge the amazing influence of my two mentors, Jacques Meller in cognition and Jean-Pierre Changeux in molecular biology and neuroscience. And as you probably know, Jacques Meller unfortunately died this year. I was in between these two mentors, and I was trying to reconcile their views, the cognitive scientist and the neuroscientist. And I began thinking deeply about this bridge. And I hope I will illustrate in this talk how we can try to build a bridge from the abstract thinking of cognitive psychology towards the mechanisms that are being proposed in neuroscience and how fruitful this dialogue can be. In particular, I think Jean-Pierre Changeux was one of the first to propose this key idea that every psychological representation is going to have a translation into neuroscience in a meaningful manner, such that it's useful to construct this bridge. I would highly recommend reading these two books, Neuronal Mind, The Biology of the Mind, and the second book that had a big influence on my own thinking, Conversations on Mind, Matter, and Mathematics, in which, with mathematician Alain Cohn, Jean-Pierre Changeux explicitly discusses the nature of mathematical objects and has these important sentences. These mathematical objects correspond to physical states of our brain in such a way that it ought in principle to be able to observe them from the outside looking in using various methods of brain imaging. This became, in a sense, my goal in life, to understand the mechanisms behind mathematical thinking and how they are implemented in the human brain. But I also had wonderful collaborators throughout these years. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the huge influence of my wife, Ghislaine Dehaene-Lamberts, who is specialist of the child's brain and infant brain, Laurent Cohen in neuropsychology, Lionel Nakaas for the studies of consciousness, Mike Posner, with whom I did my postdoc on attention, Roger Shepard, with whom I spent a few weeks in Stanford, and Elisabeth Spelker, of course, with whom I did a lot of this work on mathematics. Their work is huge, their influence is enormous on my work, and you might recognize also a few other influences during the talk. Let's start with a joke. Prehistoric man looking at a scene, a hunting scene, and saying, we have to record this, no one's going to believe us. Why? Because they see the world as an abstract world. They do not just see the world as it is, but they project onto it abstract representation. It's not just a joke. If you go to the Lascaux cave in the south of France, you see this amazing representation, which is on the one hand depictive, but also you can see a square very clearly, or rectangle, and a line of dots. And we recognize that these men already had abstract geometrical thinking. In fact, the evidence suggests that abstract geometrical thinking, abstract mathematical thinking, is already present very early on in the human species. Look at these artifacts. It's not just this ochre from South Africa, which is 70,000 years old, but it's also this zigzag, which is, a set of parallel lines. No other primate does zigzags like this, and this is 540,000 years old, so probably Homo erectus. And in fact, much earlier, we already find these bifaces, which have planes of symmetry, 2 planes of symmetry. That's why they're called bifaces. And some of these, also the spheroids that you see on the right, may be as old as 1.8 or 2 million years ago. So this is a suggestion that we've had geometry for a long time in the human species as we were able to conquer the world. I'd like to propose 3 main hypotheses for why we have this amazing human ability to make sense of the external world through mathematics and science. The first one is that, of course, we rely upon innate foundations in evolution. We inherit from our primate evolution a lot of structured representations that are already available to the human infant. And one of them, of course, is a number representation. This was the topic of my first book, The Number Sense. It is illustrated even very recently, last week, was this amazing paper showing that hummingbirds can actually count. If they get rewarded for going to the third flower, then they will go to the third flower regardless of the spacing. So they really capitalize on number. This is found in species all over the world. And the suggestion is that we have core concepts of number, core knowledge, as Elizabeth Spelke calls it, but also for space, for shape. We share these with many animal species, but they're already very abstract concepts of mathematics. But humans don't stop there. And there are two more ideas. The second idea that I'd like to introduce is neuronal recycling. We start from these pre-organized neural circuits that we inherit from our evolution, but with education, with learning, we can repurpose or recycle them. Each cultural invention that we have in humans actually rests on a neuronal niche, a circuit which was sufficiently close to the required function, sufficiently plastic to be reconverted to the novel function. And in fact, in each case, we acquire novel symbols that refine the pre-existing representations. They are fuzzy, for instance, number representations are fuzzy in animals, but with the use of symbols, they become exact and precise. So we humans are standing on top of representations acquired from evolution, but we're able to go higher than previous primate species. I will illustrate in this talk the case of the number sense. We have a number sense in the monkey brain. We are reusing these areas for arithmetic. We'll see that in a second. I just want to mention that another great example that I won't have time to discuss here is the case of reading, which I've been studying a lot as well. When we acquire the symbols of reading, we recycle a circuit in the ventral visual cortex that is involved in object recognition. And we're still doing a lot of work in this topic. You may want to check this recent paper in collaboration with MIT, with the DiCarlo group, with Richie Rajalingam, where we show that there are neurons. This is the case of one neuron in inferotemporal cortex of the untrained monkey, which is already sensitive to particular letters at particular positions, such that we can decode the ability to recognize a word from the monkey brain. So the monkey brain is already, in a sense, pre-wired or able to recognize the shapes that we selected as to create a reading system. But for lack of time, in this talk, I will concentrate on mathematics, and I want to introduce a third key idea for this talk, which is the idea of a combinatorial language of thought. We are able to assign symbols to external objects and to internal concepts that we inherit from evolution, but we can also combine these discrete symbols into nested structures. And this is a characteristic of the human species, perhaps specifically human. It allows children to create new mathematical concepts by recombining the existing ones into novel expressions in sort of infinite pyramid of new concepts. For instance, we can create the concept of a quadrilateral, a four-sided figure. Then we can create the concept of a square. It's a quadrilateral with equal sides and equal angles, equal corners. And of course, this ability is used very much in the domain of language. This was the point of the famous Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch paper. Recursive merge lies at the core of the human language faculty because it enables us to create little trees like this happy linguist make a diagram. But I am much more in line with the more recent hypothesis by Tecumseh Fitch, which he calls dendrophilia, not just the hugging of trees, of course, that's a joke, but the capacity of the human brain to create tree structures, nested combinatorial structures, similar to a language, but a language of thought, in all domains, including the domain of mathematics. So I think this is at the basis of these bifaces and other things that we find, other tools that we find in human evolution. Perhaps the man who first sculpted this thought of it as two lines of equal length touching a circle. I think that this is behind our amazing ability to understand the world, because by these grammatical constructions in a language of thought, we are able to compress external knowledge into a minimal abstract symbolic structure. In a sense, we have a better ability to compress information in the external world. So the complexity of our structures is determined by the minimal description length in this language of thought. I will illustrate this in a second. I'd like to point out that the archaeological evidence suggests that this language of thought may have emerged very early on, actually perhaps as early as 2 million years ago, and perhaps before we developed the ability to communicate these structures through language. So in a sense, it's a deeper language, an internal language, a combinatorial language of thought. These ideas are very similar to some that are developed in particular by Josh Tenenbaum and his colleagues. In a famous paper with Kemp, they showed how you could understand the creation of mental structures, such as the tree of life, the tree of species here, through a process of efficient Bayesian selection on expressions in a mental language of thought. So we can think of mental constructions in the child as the growth of a tree, or perhaps the growth of a coral, a magnificent coral. The child's brain is growing in a way that differentiates concepts, creates new concepts out of all the ones, in a sort of infinite tree that can grow and grow. This is the tree of the construction of mathematics. And I've tried to explain these ideas in this recent book, How We Learn. So let's go into this step by step. First, what's the evidence for an ancient sense of approximate quantity underlying human mathematics? Well, this is a slide from my PhD work a long time ago with Jacques Meller. We were looking at this extremely simple task. You see a number and you have to decide whether it's larger or smaller than some reference, like 65. So press a key to say larger, press a key to say smaller. And you see that the reaction time is not at all constant. It's not doing steps. It's not symbolic. It's based on the quantity. So the more distant the quantity to be compared is from the reference, the faster you are in a sort of continuous curve. The suggestion here is that we do not stick with the symbols, but we convert the symbols into a quantity. And in the end, we compare the numbers just like we would if the numbers were presented as quantity, as sets of dots, for instance, or just as weights that we would weight to decide which is the larger. This is a rather amazing situation where the symbols could suffice. You could say, well, 99 is obviously larger because the 9 on the left is larger than 6, but that's not what subjects are doing. They're doing for the continuous quantity. There's been growing evidence that a sense of quantity underlies these sorts of judgments. And in fact, there's a tight link between symbolic comparison and non-symbolic comparison, suggests when you get educated in mathematics, your sense of non-symbolic comparison gets more refined. This has been the work that we did together with Manuel Piazza. So education refines and makes more precise the sense of quantity, but we always rely on the sense of quantity. And in my early work using fMRI, I was able to pinpoint where this is lying in the brain. Whenever we do number comparison or other arithmetic tasks, you can see activation in the bilateral intraparietal sulcus at the back of the brain, here in the dorsal parietal pathway. And you see that activation tightly tracks this distance effect. Distance effect is in reaction time, here is in orange. Activation is in blue. There is more activation for the more difficult number comparisons. We were bold enough with Jean-Pierre Changeux to propose a particular neural code for how information might be encoded in the brain when it codes a particular quantity. And the idea was rather simple, is that when we see a set of objects as the input, we may have a sort of mental map of where these objects are, and just it ends up with one activation, one pointer for each object. This normalizes for the size of the object, and then all you have to do is sum the activation on the map to get to numerosity detectors. And so we predicted, this model made a simple prediction, that at the output, we should have neurons that are tuned to a particular number. There might be a neuron tuned to 1, another or set of neurons tuned to 2, to 4, to 8. And the prediction of the model is that they should be on a log scale. There would be constant tuning on a logarithmic scale for a number. And it was rather amazing when a few years later, after I spent actually quite a long time walking around monkey labs and telling them, you should look at number, actually Earl Miller and Andreas Nieder at MIT were bold enough to look into this. And Andreas Nieder made fabulous work in this direction, looking at how monkeys encode number. And they found that, first of all, monkeys could decide whether two sets have the same number or not. They could be trained to do a numerical match to sample, you could record from neurons in prefrontal cortex, but also guided by our imaging work, they went into the intraparietal sulcus of the monkey. And there you would find, exactly as we expected from the model, neurons that are tuned to a particular quantity. This was a neuron tuned to 1, a neuron tuned to 2, a neuron tuned to 3, and you can see that it gets fuzzier. This is organized on a log scale, so we have tuning curves that the monkey tends to confuse 4 and 5, for instance, at the neural level, just like we confuse 4 and 5 at the behavioral level. The neural code could explain the distance effect that we were finding in both monkeys and humans. And the locations where these neurons are found is a plausible homologue of where the humans activate cortex when they compare numbers or when they perform arithmetic operations. So there is really a sense in which our arithmetic abilities are grounded in a system which has a very old evolutionary history and a neural code which is already present in the primate, in the non-human primate, the macaque monkey. Do we have the same code in humans? We cannot quite see single neurons in humans. This remains quite difficult, not completely impossible, but quite difficult. But we could do it in an indirect manner. And in this experiment with Manuela Piazza, what we did was to habituate the number system. By repeatedly presenting the same quantity, we could have an habituation of the fMRI signal. So we would present 16, 16, 16 many times in the fMRI scanner. And then when we presented deviants, such as the number 8 or 13, or maybe 16 or 20 or 32, we found that the dishabituation was a function of the distance to the preceding number. So if we presented 8 after 16, we got a recovery from adaptation compared to presenting 16 again. And the shape of this recovery, as you can see, is tracing a tuning curve, which is extremely similar to the tuning curve that was found in the monkey. So in this indirect manner, we could tell that the left and right parietal areas were the areas of the brain, of the human brain, where there were tuning curves that were very similar to those that were found in the monkey. There's a similar encoding of the log of the number in the case of this non-symbolic presentation of sets of dots. So fMRI adaptation was fitting extremely well with single neuron recordings in the monkey. And we probably have the same very similar code for number when we start in life. Now, second idea, we recycle this parietal quantity system for symbolic mathematics. Well, so can we show that we still use exactly the same circuit, but in a more differentiated, more precise manner when we deal with symbols? Well, we could do the habituation trick again, and this is an experiment that I still love, where we, in fact, use a subliminal repetition suppression. The question we asked here is, what would happen if we presented a symbolic number, like number 9 here, but before it, we would adapt the system with the presentation of another number, which could be the same or could be different. In this example, it's 9 preceded by 9, but it could also be 9 preceded by 4 or 9 preceded by 1. And interestingly, the first number is not even visible in this experiment. It's non-conscious. I will not have time today to talk about my research on consciousness, but for me, this was the beginning of thinking about how deeply can non-conscious operations go, because what you can see on the right here is that there's a strong effect of this hidden subliminal prime. When the prime is the same as the target, when the quantity is repeated, even if it's a different notation, a word followed by a digit, you see a reduction in activation. You see the bold effect here as a function of time being reduced compared to when we present twice the same quantity. And this repetition suppression, which is quantity-based, is occurring once again in the left and in the right intraparietal cortex, suggesting that even when we present symbols, the symbol 9, the word 9, we still access the same quantity system. In fact, now we can go much further. This repetition suppression is no longer needed. We can go directly to decoding the number from the brain activity. And this has been the beautiful work of Evelyn Egger in the lab. Just ask the subjects to memorize a number, a task very similar to the monkey. And while the monkey is remembering the number in his head, collect high-resolution fMRI, build a decoder. And what you find is that you can decode which number the subject has in mind better than chance. You can tell whether it's 4, 8, 16, or 32. from voxels in the left and in the right intraparietal sulcus. And you can generalize to novel lists with novel presentations of the same numbers. And in the more recent work, Elisa Castaldi and Evelyn Egger in the lab have been showing that you can decode number in a specific manner in the parietal lobe. You can also decode it in earlier areas of the occipital lobe, but only in the parietal lobe is the code amplified when you attend to number. So attending to number amplifies the number code in the parietal cortex. And what's most amazing, I think, is that you can also decode symbolic numbers from this area. So if you remember the digit 9, you will also be able to decode it and to get some partial generalization from number symbols to the numerosity. So there is really a shared representation of quantity in these areas, shared between non-symbolic and symbolic presentations. Now, in recent work, we wanted really to push this idea of neuronal recycling to an extreme. So is it just that we attach symbols to quantities? Or according to the recycling idea, is it the case that the whole pyramid of high-level mathematics relies on this parietal representation system? So we ask this question in professional mathematicians. Do they still use the same sort of circuits when they do professional level mathematics, when they think not of very concrete numbers, but extremely high-level concepts such as functional spaces or infinite dimensional space and so on? So we had mathematicians lie in the scanner, and what they were listening to was not at all numbers. There were no numbers involved, but they were listening to sentences, statements that could be true or false or even absurd in mathematics or in non-mathematics. Let me have you listen to a few of these statements. Oops.
There's no non-vanishing continuous tangent vector field on even-dimensional spheres.
So if you're not a mathematician, it's probably gibberish for you. But for a mathematician, this evokes mental images and concepts of mathematics, and you can tell that this is actually a true statement. Mathematicians were thinking about it for about 4 seconds before they were responding. And we also had non-mathematical statements that were just as difficult in order to compare math and non-math. And what we found in very simple terms, there's a lot of details in the paper, but what we found is that each time there is a mathematical statement, at the end of the statement, you can see in the mathematician's brain a circuit light up only when it's mathematical statements. Whether the statements are in geometry, or in algebra, or in topology, the domain does not matter. These are all these different curves here. But if it's not mathematics, this circuit will not light up. This is the pink curve in the bottom. And in control subjects who do not understand the statements, there is no such activation. Where is this math-related activation taking place? It's taking place in the bilateral intraparietal sulcus. And it's actually tightly overlapping with the activation that we get in the same subject when we present numbers compared to other pictures, or calculation compared to just sentence processing. It's the same areas that we all have. You don't have to be a mathematician to have activation in this area, but you have to be a mathematician to activate these areas by these high-level statements, which otherwise would be meaningless. Mathematicians recycle the very same circuit for high-level mathematical thinking. And this circuit is not just the bilateral intraparietal sulcus, but we understand now that there's also a contribution of other areas in the more ventral temporal lobe and in the dorsal prefrontal cortex. It's important to understand that these areas have nothing to do with language areas. I think this was an important finding of this study. There is a language of mathematics. There's no doubt that you need to use a sort of language in order to understand these statements. But the areas that are activated, which are in yellow here, actually spare the classical language areas of the left hemisphere. They are bilateral in both left and right hemispheres, and they completely avoid these inferior frontal gyrus and superior temporal sulcus areas that have to do with natural language. So we're not using natural language when we reason about mathematics. We use an inner language, which makes much more use of the parietal areas, the dorsal prefrontal cortex, and ventral temporal cortex of both hemispheres. It's important also to understand that this network is not a particularly visual network. It's not sensory driven. It's a highly abstract network. And we got to that through experiments that were performed recently by Maria Malric, in which she was able to scan blind mathematicians I don't know if you know this, but you can be blind and be an excellent mathematician. There's a famous historical example, which is the case of Nicholas Sanderson, who held the chair of Newton, the Lucasian chair of mathematics in Cambridge. And today we can still find excellent mathematicians. We found 3 of them, including one who has really a major theorem in high-level mathematics. And we scanned them and compare them to cited mathematicians that we also scanned. And you can see that when they listen to the same statements and make the same sort of reasoning about the statements, deciding whether they're true or false, they actually activate very much the same areas, including the bilateral intraparietal areas. They are able to reason by high-level mathematics without the sort of experiential visual input that we consider essential, but in fact is not. What is essential is the projection of abstract concepts that we inherit from our evolution, including the concept of number, the concept of space, the concept of measurement, and so on. In fact, mathematicians do have small differences when they are blind compared to when they are non-blind. And this is another great example of recycling. Mathematicians use their occipital cortex, which in the blind, of course, is no longer used for vision. So what we found is that they actually activate more the occipital cortex than non-blind mathematicians, sighted mathematicians. So in a sense, there is an extreme form of recycling, not just for abstract mathematical concepts in the intraparietal sulcus, but also going all the way into the occipital cortex when it is no longer used for vision. I go to my 3rd point, and I want to perhaps spend a little bit more time on this. This idea that humans possess a language of thought capable of recursively recombining mathematical concepts, and this is how we grow the tree of mathematics. Any concept that we grow in our mind is like a coral. We can grow progressive differentiation of concepts by building tree-like structures that create more and more abstract concepts progressively. So can we test that? Well, first of all, if you just look at the structure of mathematics, some aspects of mathematics are very obviously language-based. They have 3 structures. You just have to look at a mathematical expression, such as this one here. And the parentheses already clearly express the structure of mathematics as a tree structure organized as nested hierarchies. The 3 minus 2 is inside this structure, which is with the +4. The +4 applies to the whole of the 3 minus 2. So in this work with Masaki Maruyama, we actually studied whether the brain areas that we studied prior to this work understand this language and react to these structured expressions. In order to do this, what we did was to present entire expressions that were meaningful, such as this one here, which could be left branching or right branching. And then we progressively deconstructed them such that at level 2, there was only 2 levels of nesting remaining and some garbage on the side, and then only 1 level remaining, and then no organization whatsoever at level 0 here. And what we found was that our areas, in particular the right intraparietal sulcus and the right ventral temporal region here, and to some extent also the middle frontal gyrus, still activate, but now in proportion to the amount of structure which is present in these expressions. And with magnetoencephalography, we can see that this is a very fast response. The brain rapidly passes the language of mathematics in these areas, and we get responses that are organized according to the amount of structure in mathematical expressions. So yes, of course, mathematics is a language. It's a language that, again, spares the classical language areas, but is organized according to nested structures. But I want to claim that this is actually much deeper, and that even when we have completely non-symbolic expressions, when we look at the external world, we applied a sort of language, in this case, a language of geometry, to what we see. And we've started to do experiments on this topic with Maria Malric a few years ago, where we simply present to subjects, including young children, some spatial structures, spatial sequences that are organized, such as the one on the right here. And we tell a little story to the children. We tell them that there's a fish, which is called Bloop. And Bloop, the fish, likes to hide in little ponds. And so we will see Bloop hiding in different ponds, and you have to guess where he's going to go next. So let's look at this little task here. Okay, I bet you know where Bloop is going to go next. Okay. is going to go here and here and here. Everybody agrees on this, even though you've not seen the sequence. So how can you know this? Well, you know this because you've extracted the structure of the sequence, which is a zigzag, just like on the prehistoric artifact I showed you at the beginning. And this zigzag structure is immediately obvious to you. Why? How is it that this can be so obvious? Well, in studying this domain, and not just this zigzag sequence, but many other sequences, such as two rectangles, for instance, we found that we need a language in order to understand what children and adults are doing in this task. We need a language that has primitives of moving around the circle here, like +1, +2, and so on, and also primitives of symmetry around the vertical axis, the horizontal axis, the oblique axis here. And we need a language that combines these symmetries and rotations in a meaningful manner, also using numbers. So for instance, the 4 segment, which seems so obvious, is actually a pretty abstract formula that says, well, you have to apply a horizontal symmetry, and you have to do that several times, actually 4 times, 4 segments, each time starting at a different location, and the start location moves around the circle. So this is what this formula is saying. Draw segments of 2 4 times. Well, we need a language that is nested, because you can have nested structures. So for instance, 2 rectangles is actually 2 parallel segments that form the first rectangle, and then the second one, which is rotated. And do we really need this in order to understand behavior? Well, if you look at the behavior of subjects, whether it is predicting the next item or just remembering the sequence in working memory, what you find is that the ability of subjects, the performance of subjects, is directly driven by this language of geometry, by the minimal description length, what is also called Kolmogorov complexity, the length of the shortest expression that can compress the sequence in memory. What is happening here is that all of the sequences are of length 8. And 8 items in working memory, in spatial working memory, is a lot. It's just above the normal limit of working memory. So subjects make a lot of errors when it's a random sequence with no regularity. But as the sequence gets more and more regular, according to our language of thought, errors drop to 0. You are able to remember because you compress the information using a language of geometry. French adults do this, but it's not dependent on education. You also find it in preschoolers and in Munduruku adults from the Amazon that have very little education, no formal education. The language is almost the same. It may need to be simplified just a little bit in those non-trained, non-educated subjects. What's lovely about this task is that it's completely non-verbal. I claim that it is a high-level mathematical task, but it's non-verbal, and you can simplify it very much. In this simplification here, we just present subjects with the moving dots, and we tell them, just track them with your eyes. There's nothing else to do than move your eyes to the next target when it appears. But of course, what subjects do is they don't just wait for the next target to appear. Their eyes actually anticipate on the next target. And what I'm plotting here is the amount of anticipation for each sequence. For instance, the one we just saw a second ago is the 4 segments is shown here. And the amount of anticipation is 0, means there is a lot of anticipation. The gray line here is for a random sequence with no regularity. You see that there's not much anticipation. But for all of the regular sequences, there is anticipation by gaze, and the amount of anticipation is again predicted by the regularity in this internal language of thought. We encode geometrical structures implicitly, even when we are just told to move our eyes around to gaze at the targets. We cannot help, as humans, to detect these structures and encode them. And we can literally see the structures. So for instance, the 4 segments, you see the beginning here. The 2 squares, you actually, the beginning of the first square and the beginning of the second square are a little bit more difficult. And then the amount of prediction and anticipation gets easier. So there is a sort of direct translation in the gaze of the internal structures that I claim are being represented in the mind of the subject. And now we can just put subjects in a scanner and ask them to move their eyes to the targets as we present sequences of various complexity. And we see that this minimal description length, the Kolmogorov complexity in this postulated language of thought, predicts the amount of activation, again, in this dorsal math-related circuit, particularly in the intraparietal sulcus here, but especially also in the prefrontal cortex, going down into the inferior frontal gyrus, but again, just dorsal to the classical language areas. It's not in language areas, but just dorsal to them. that we find this complexity-related activation. And if we control for parameters like saccade distance or the memory demands, we find that it's really just this inferior frontal cortex region that perhaps has this ability to do embeddings, to do recursive nesting of linguistic-like structures, but now in the domain of geometry and mathematics. We also find a lot of activation in more dorsal prefrontal cortex when we look at the actual performance of the subjects, and their actual anticipation correlates with this dorsal prefrontal cortex activation. So there's something in the prefrontal cortex of human subjects that allows them to construct abstract structures, language-like structures, but outside of classical language areas when it is in the domain of mathematics. In fact, we can see this on this slide here. You can see in red, once again, the language activations. And on a single subject basis, we can isolate the language areas and see that they are really not contributing, not activated. In fact, they tend to be inhibited during this geometry task, this spatial working memory task. Whereas if we look at calculation-related areas, which are in blue here, all of these areas, even on a single subject basis, are activated in proportion to the geometrical complexity of the sequences that are presented to the subjects. So once again, the language of geometry overlaps in the brain with areas that encode number and space. Why am I so excited about this work? Well, I'm excited because I think we are reaching a stage where we have language-like structures, but they're not really linguistic in the classical sense, and they are simple enough that the task can be applied to the monkey. And this is what we're trying to do with my ex-postdoc, Liping Wang, who is now his own lab in Shanghai at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Liping is doing this amazing work training monkeys. I wish I could tell you that the monkeys have been trained to do the exact same geometrical task. They are not exactly at this stage yet, but they're able to do pretty amazing geometrical sequences. For instance, in this case, you can see that the monkey has been trained to do the reverse geometrical pointing. So we show him A, B, C, and he does C, B, A. And we've been able to show in this initial work that he's able to understand the structure of this sequence. He understands that there is a mirror relationship. And so if you do A, B, C, D, he does D, C, B, A. I hope you can see that. Tests show that the monkey actually understood the task, was able to do mirroring even in generalization to a novel length of the sequence from length 2 to length 3, from length 3 to length 4, and also, as you can see now, generalizing to novel spatial structures that he had never seen before. So monkeys are able to learn a spatial working memory task. They're able to do it forward and reverse. Their abilities are quite high, but if we are correct, and we're beginning to see that, there's going to be key differences in the way they encode this information in the brain. They are not going to be able to recurse. They're not going to be able to encode nested structures. And we think we begin to have evidence for that now in this work. They are much slower in learning this sort of task than humans. And so far, we see that they have no grasp of hierarchical structure. They treat it as a linear structure. They have a recency effect, but they don't see we don't see a hierarchical organization like we see in the human brain. I'm also excited about this monkey work because in this case, and this is work that we do in Neurospin, thanks to Fanis Panagiotaropoulos, Timo van Kerkoli, and Marie Bellet, we are able to go down to the neuronal code. Just like Andreas Nieder was able to look at the number code, we are going to look for the sequence code. We are starting this work now looking at the sequence code in the prefrontal cortex of monkeys and seeing that they do encode a sequence of pictures, for instance, in similar way to the spatial sequences that I showed you before. If you show them a sequence of 4 identical objects, we can decode from recordings of hundreds of neurons which object was presented. And if it's, let's say, 3 blue objects followed by 1 orange object, we can see that we decode 3 blue objects followed by 1 orange object. But it's more than that. We can also see the code for number kicking in here. So we see that we can decode, this is the first object, this is the second object, this is the third object, this is the fourth object, and so on and so forth. And we begin to see how these 2 codes are combined together so that one object is assigned to a particular number, another object is assigned to the second number, a third object is assigned to the third number, and so on and so forth, in a manner that looks like a Cartesian product. So we begin to understand the neural code for sequences in the monkey brain in this sort of language-like tasks mini language is needed to encode these representations. And if we are right, we are going to find that the monkey brain is able to encode some sequences, but not others. So there's sort of a gap with respect to what monkeys are able to encode and what humans are able to encode. And I'd like to finish this talk by going back to actual experiments that we're doing in a very similar way in monkeys and humans, going back to this idea of geometry. We see the world in geometry. We cannot help but see squares, project geometrical concepts onto the outside world, even if they are not present here. So are humans truly unique in their ability to conceive of a square? This has been the topic of the PhD thesis of Matthias Sable-Meyer, still ongoing, where we look at the human concept of quadrilateral. Again, with this idea that in order to understand the concept of a square, you need a sort of internal language that tells you, well, this is a shape with 4 equal sides and 4 equal corners. So what Matthias did was to create a hierarchy of shapes with, on one hand, very high-level regularities. The square is an extreme, of course, of a rectangle, but also, as we go down in this hierarchy, fewer and fewer geometrical properties. So all the way down to this irregular shape that has no particular properties except that it is a quadrilateral. So our question was, can we find that shape regularity predicts perceptual complexity and predicts, for instance, memory or perception in human subjects? In order to do this, we adopt an extremely simple task. The reason, of course, is that we want to be able to go to the monkey. So the task is the following. You have to pick up the oddball shape, the odd one out, the intruder. There are always 6 shapes. 5 are identical up to some rotation and the size change, and 1 is a deviant. The deviant is created by moving the bottom right vertex in one of these other locations. The amount of movement is exactly the same across all of these shapes. So in principle, it should be essentially the same task of detecting the outlier, regardless of which is the reference shape here. However, what we find is that the ability to detect the outlier is extremely dependent on geometrical regularity. And we call it a major effect of geometrical regularity because if you look at the data, the error rate for detecting the intruder is 0, very close to 0, when you have a rectangle or a square as the standard shape, but it goes as high as 40%, not quite a chance, but very high error rate when you go to an irregular shape. And I repeat, it's the same amount of displacement of the right corner that you are trying to detect, but you really cannot detect it very well when it's a random shape. You encode the irregularities much better, and therefore you detect the outlier much better when it is a regular shape. And you see this sort of monotonic effect as a function of shape regularity. We have found that this effect is almost universally present whenever we test human subjects. Let me show you a number of examples of replications. First of all, you can just replicate with variance in the way the shapes are displayed. In particular, we invert which shapes plays the role of the intruder and which plays the role of the standard shape. But this does not make any difference here in terms of error rate. See this beautiful correlation. We can do a more classical visual search task, similar to Anne Treisman's work, where you have to detect where is the intruder, whether there is an intruder present or not. Again, the error rate, but also the search slope is proportional to geometrical regularity. This is important because it shows that there is really no pop-out effect. There is always a visual search. It's a serial search, but the speed of the search is faster when there is more geometrical regularity. We also find that subjective ratings are sufficient to get these geometrical regularity effects. Human subjects can tell that some shapes are simpler than others, and we find the same ordering. So it means that this is a consciously accessible language. Subjects can tell about these properties. We can present these shapes in a sequence format. So it's enough to present the shapes not as a little quadrilateral, but actually as just 4 dots located at the corners, at the vertices of the shapes. And in this case, again, we find that the more regular the shape, the more you are able to detect that the 4th corner is misplaced compared to the standard shape. Why is this important? Because it shows that this is beyond the ventral visual pathway. It's not just visual perception, it's actually an abstraction of shape, which can be applied both to the static shape or to the sequence presentation. And finally, does it depend on education? Well, no. We can test preschoolers And they already have this effect, in fact, in a more extreme form. So the error rates go all the way to about 70% here for the irregular shapes. The rectangles and square are already very particular here, but the regularity effect is already present even if we exclude the rectangle and the square. So same sort of regularity effect that we find in adults. And perhaps even more important, we can test a non-Western subject. We went to the HIMBA with the help of Serge Caparros. We were able to test these people who are pastoral people in Namibia. We have no access to formal education, and you see that the results are once again highly correlated with the geometrical regularity effect that we find in French educated human adults. Now, the key question, of course, is do we find the same sort of effect in non-human primates? Can we test non-human primates? We collaborated with Joël Fagot, who has an amazing facility in the south of France where baboons are essentially free to take any sort of test, psychological test, on a touch screen. They can enter this booth at any time of the day, maybe at 2 in the morning. They go and get these video games. And so we proposed to them this intruder test. We train them a lot, actually, on the intruder test by showing them these sort of pictures, which are non-geometrical, where they just have to understand that they have to pick the oddball shape in order to get a reward. And we presented them a lot of pairs of shapes, such as these two flowers here, first training them and then testing them to make sure that they understood and they could generalize this intruder task. So what you see here is just each curve, each color here is one baboon being trained. Initially, they make a lot of errors, but after training, they're able to pick up the oddball almost perfectly, regardless of whether it's, for instance, a fruit in the middle of apple, and so on and so forth. Once they pass a criterion for training, we put them on generalization. You can see that on the very first block, they already generalize, and so they are ready at this point to move to the geometrical shapes. And they understand the intruder task. So what happens when we present them the quadrilaterals that we presented to humans, our 11 quadrilaterals? Well, you can see the results now. On the first trial, they are essentially at chance. Even though they understand the intruder task, they don't understand these geometrical shapes. It is as if all of these shapes were quadrilaterals to them, and that's it. It's the same shape, so they don't pick the intruder. With more training, they are able to progress and they reach about 50% performance, which is not great, but it's much better than chance, given that there are 6 possible shapes out of which you must pick the intruder. But even then, there is no regularity effect. The correlation with the human results is very poor. The baboons don't show much better performance with rectangle and square, and progressively worse performance. They have, for instance, better performance for some reason with this particular shape that we call the kite. There is no regularity effect that we can see whatsoever. However, they don't perform randomly. And if you look at this matrix, you'll see this is a matrix of correlation between the different baboons across the different stages of training. With training, they become more and more similar to each other. So they perform something, but something very different from humans. And we managed to understand what baboons were doing by using different models. Simple idea, of course, is that baboons have a visual system very similar to humans. So what happens if we try to simulate a ventral visual system, the shape perception system? A good way to simulate it is through convolutional neural networks, and we use the CORNET networks being developed by the Di Carlo lab at MIT, which provides the best model for what is happening in the ventral visual pathways of the macaque monkey. So we just put our shapes through this classical convolutional neural network model of object perception. We get activation vectors, and we simply decide that the outlier object is the vector which is the most distant from the mean of the others. This is one way to perform the task using just the ventral visual pathway. What we find is that if we simulate all of our trials using such a convolutional neural network, we get an excellent fit for what happens in the baboons. What you see here is all of the baboons that got a lot of training and the neural network model, and you see this square indicates a high level of correlation of the neural network model with the baboon performance. And in a multiple regression, the convolutional neural network predictions are an excellent predictor of the baboon behavior for all of these baboons. So in a sense, the baboons are just picking the outlier based on visual perception. But the humans do something very different. This model does not capture well the human behavior, as you can see with these bars here. What we need to capture the human behavior is a symbolic model, a model that just lists the discrete internal properties of the shapes, decides that there is a right angle or two equal sides or parallel lines and so on and so forth, and just computes the number of properties that are different for one shape compared to the other shapes. If we do that, we get an excellent prediction of the human performance. This is the orange bars here. And in a multiple regression, interestingly, we find that baboon behavior is well captured by the convolutional neural network. The symbolic model captures the human behavior, but fails to capture the baboon data. Even at the individual data level, there is no baboon which is well predicted by this symbolic model. And we find that the Himba and the preschoolers are in between. They actually use both strategies. They seem to be influenced by the convolutional neural network strategy, the visual strategy, but they are also influenced by the symbolic model, even in the absence of education. That's why their curves were not perfectly predicted by geometrical regularity, but they have a mixture of the two strategies. So the claim here is that we have, I think for the first time, direct evidence that the human mind is very special. There's something very particular about the human mind in projecting discrete symbolic properties in a sort of language of thought, a language of geometry, on a task as simple as detecting whether a square has been changed, whether a corner has been displaced in a square or a quadrilateral. I'd like to reach my conclusions now and try to leave you with a few key ideas. First idea, I think it's very clear that all humans, regardless of language or culture, possess the very same core concepts that we inherit from evolutions. We all start with the same cognitive apparatus. In fact, it is shared with non-human primates, the sense of number, sense of shape, sense of space, and so on and so forth. Humans have something on top of that. Humans have an internal language of thought. It's the same that we find in the Himba and in the educated French subjects. It's a language of thought that is able, first of all, to assign symbols and discretize the concepts, numbers, lines, length, angles, and then to combine them recursively into mental programs. Because we have the same language of thought, we have the same notion of complexity, the same shapes and the same mental programs, the same little snippets of expressions in this language of thoughts appear to us as simple and others are complex. And I think this can explain why mathematics is so universal across the world, why we find, for instance, the so-called Pascal triangle in China. Nothing to do with Pascal, the two cultures converge into the same idea. This is because we have the same internal language of thought that allows us to construct simple concepts and more complex mathematical concepts out of the simple ones. There's cross-cultural convergence towards the same shapes, the same concepts of mathematics. There is an important message for human evolution here. This view is right. During hominization, and maybe as early as 2 million years ago, our brain architecture must have changed relative to other primates in a way that facilitates the acquisition of recursive languages. There's something quite particular in neural circuits of the human brain that we are looking for at the single neuron level at this moment. And if this view is right, it's not just in language areas, it's in many brain networks, including these dorsal, prefrontal, and parietal networks that are engaged in mathematical thinking. There is probably multiple recursive languages and perhaps a general ability of the human mind to grasp recursive structures in all domains. And one final word concerning neural networks and the recent trend to use neural networks in artificial intelligence. There has been enormous progress, of course, in this domain, but we've just seen an example where even the most elementary of human abilities, recognizing a square, is not well captured by present-day neural networks. There is an important effort to make in order to capture symbolic thinking, and for the moment, it's not well captured by present-day neural networks. I'm not saying this is impossible, of course. I'm sure that there is an internal neural network in our mind. Just, I think we are missing the basic principle of how to code symbols and how to code languages in these neural networks. Finally, one final thought, I became more and more interested in recent days about education and how we create this mental growth. How do we create mental cores in our cortex? How do we differentiate the cortex into more and more abstract and more complex lines of thinking, including in mathematics? I became recently the president of a newly founded scientific council for education in France. And we are trying to apply the concepts of cognitive science in order to help the education system. And in this context, I wrote this recent book, How We Learn, that tried to synthesize a few key ideas from cognitive science about how the human brain gets educated and manages to grow. And I'd like to share with you just a few key ideas to conclude. I think we have, first of all, to capitalize on the fundamental core concepts that all children share. We may want to determine the order in which the composite concepts are constructed. It's important to understand the pyramid of concepts and to teach them in the right order. It's important to use the proper language and symbols in order to facilitate this mental composition. In a sense, language, the communicative aspects of language, are a guide to the construction of these internal structures. They select which structures are the most appropriate to build in a given culture. But we also have to consider that there are non-linguistic mental tools, games, metaphors that best rely on the existing concepts and best facilitate the recycling of these concepts to a higher level. For instance, the concept of the number line, which brings together space and number. The concepts of board games that actually make you play with this number line and have been shown to facilitate education to arithmetic in young children. This is why my lab creates some games. Bob Glushko was kind enough to mention that we are creating computer games that demonstrate that when we use them in the classroom, they actually help children develop mathematical concepts a little bit faster. And finally, in this book, How We Learn, I describe what I call the 4 pillars of learning: attention, engagement and curiosity, error feedback and consolidation. There's no time to go into that today, but I think that human learning algorithms are getting better and better understood. There's still a lot of work to do on symbolic thinking, but as we understand these algorithms, we can begin to successfully apply them in the education domain. And I think the time is right, actually, for us cognitive psychologists and neuropsychologists to go inside the school system and try to help and facilitate the process of education. With this final thought, I want to thank you for your attention and show you the beautiful place where I work, Neurospin, south of Paris. I hope that we can welcome you in Paris one day, Bob, and vice versa. I hope that we can meet in one of the next cognitive science meetings without the coronavirus. And once again, thank you very, very much for your attention.